Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we'll hear from Vanessa Warheit of the EV Charging for All Coalition and Adam Berry from the Colorado Energy Office about implementing EV charging building codes. They'll discuss the coalition's new EV Building Codes Toolkit, which is designed to help community organizers and state policymakers integrate equity into building code policy. Because this is a unique combination of buildings policy and EV policy, we have a special guest host. Zack Strauss, host of Atlas Public Policy's Buildings Hub Live, will be leading this conversation. So here's your host, Zack Strauss.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to EV Hub Live. My name is Zack Strauss, policy analyst, and as Nicole mentioned, building decarbonization lead at Atlas Public Policy, and I'll be pinch hitting for Nick today and stepping in as your guest host. For today's episode, we'll discuss all things EV building codes and their important roles in incentivizing EV adoption and getting more chargers in the ground. Today's episode of EV Hub Live is hosted in partnership with our sister show, Buildings Hub Live, where I am the host. Here at Atlas, we work across a host of climate work streams, including EVs and building decarbonization. So before we jump into our discussion today, I'd like to say a few words on, you guessed it, Buildings Hub. Here at Atlas, we manage a one-stop shop data analysis tool for building sector decarbonization called Buildings Hub. If you're interested in heat pump market data, state policies and funding programs, federal funding opportunities, we've got you covered, and a whole lot more. We'd love to have you register for our portal and join the Buildings Hub community today. We put a link here in the site below. Check it out. I think it's pretty rad. Now, for today's episode, we are currently live on YouTube and LinkedIn, and we encourage all of the people in our audience to send us over your questions, and we'll pull them in as we go along. You can do so through the Q&A portal through our YouTube channel. Don't be shy. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce today's guests. We are joined by Vanessa Warheit, Senior Program Advisor at EV Charging for All, and Adam Berry, Senior Program Manager with the Colorado Energy Office. Thank you very much to the both of you for being here today on EV Hub Live.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to have you. So we got lots to cover, only half an hour. So we're going to jump right in to talk about EV codes. So let's start with the scene setting question. From a high level, what work are y'all doing or have done in EV building codes? And what excites you about this work? Let's start with Vanessa.
Thanks for having me. I am the national lead for the EV Charging for All Coalition. We started in California, which is where I'm based, in 2020, and we've been really effective in pushing California's Cal Green building codes to be more equitable for EV charging, especially for residents of multifamily housing, as well as also being more affordable for builders. And I've also been an EV driver for over 10 years, and I have been an EV driver who lived in rental housing and as a homeowner, and I've had on and off street parking. So I have a lot of lived experience for this work.
All across the spectrum, huh? Looking forward to matching that lived experience with the work you're doing on the ground in this space. Over to Adam.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I lead the state of Colorado's work on building energy codes, and there's really a major nexus between the building energy code work we're doing and the EV ready building codes that the state of Colorado has been promoting and adopting. So Colorado is a home rule state, so all of our building code adoption happens primarily at the local level. And so a lot of our work has been really developing codes for EV readiness in the state of Colorado, but also working with local governments to actually be adopting those codes and really enforcing those codes. So, and I am a hopeful EV driver soon. I am not currently, but I am hoping to be one soon.
What are you thinking about getting?
Oh, I've looked at, on the lower cost end side of things, probably Kia Niro or the Hyundai Kona are the two that I've been looking at.
Right on. All right, we're going to stick with Adam. So get your insight from all the work you're doing in building your state level code to level the playing field for our audience who may not be familiar with the jargon or the code specific terms. What is an EV building code? What does that mean? And what does it mean for building to be EV ready or EV capable?
Yeah, so an EV building code is really just a code that is directing the new construction or major renovations of buildings to be prepared for future EV charging. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be an EV charger installed, but it means that the infrastructure, the electrical infrastructure primarily, is going to be in place to support the future installation of EV charging. And so, we have a lot of different terms, all the way from EV charging installed down to EV ready, down to EV capable. So when we're talking about EV ready, what we're really meaning in most cases is that all of the equipment, the electrical equipment, is in place essentially short of the charger. So the wiring, the conduit, your electrical panel, the transformer outside, all are capable of supporting the EV charging, but you don't actually have the charger installed. Whereas EV capable is a bit of a lower level without some of the requirements for wiring or the actual, plug-in receptacle or junction box for a hardwired EV charger to be installed.
I got it. So you have the lower end EV capable, which is mostly conduit and the space in your panel. And then going to capable, you have sort of that end receptacle or that box where you can really plug it in. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, so I think ready is the latter of the two.
The latter, yes, that's right.
Yeah, so a lot of these different thresholds exist because, of cost impact as well as impact of doing the work in new construction versus doing the work in a future retrofit. And obviously the primary goal of doing this during new construction is to make sure that buildings are being built for EVs, for EV charging in the most cost-effective way.
Vanessa, anything to add? I know you have some experience working in California where there may be some nuances to this conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to add that in the toolkit, in making the toolkit, it became really clear. We actually have a column in our compendium about, does the definition of EV ready change from, we use the IECCs, and what Adam is describing is the most common, but it's not universal. And in California, we actually pushed to get EV ready redefined. So in California, in Cal Green, EV ready is actually defined as a fully operational receptacle, because for multifamily housing, this is really crucial, because even if you've got all that wire and you've got that blind junction box, you still can't plug in. So now you still have to call an electrician. Well, you're a renter, like you don't have the authority or the wherewithal to call an electrician. You don't maybe even know that blind junction box is an EV charging potential receptacle, right? So the Cal Green now defines EV ready differently from most other places. And we encourage places that are considering new EV codes to use that language instead. And it also redefines the quantity. If you have a completed circuit, based on the National Electrical Code, you can potentially, we're trying to get the code changed, but we are hopeful, you can actually have less than 40 amps, which means you can serve more spaces for the same dollars. And builders really like that. And drivers like that, because at the end of the day, it's always better to have some access to some power for charging than no access at all. And low power level 2 delivers enough. It basically gives you like 90 miles overnight, and the average person drives 37 or 39 miles a day.
Very interesting. You mentioned Cal Green. I'd like to hear more about that later in a conversation. For my research, it's one of the most stringent and most ambitious EV codes in the country, with some of the highest requirements. So I'd like to dig into that maybe later in our conversation. But I'd like to stick with you because you just launched an EV Building Codes Toolkit. So can you tell our audience about your work, any conclusions we should take away, how policymakers or developers or advocates can best apply it to their work?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is I just want to double down on something that Adam said. And if you want to pull up the new construction is least cost slide, the reason codes are so critically important and this toolkit is such a useful tool is, if you get these codes in, you are going to save a boatload of money. I know EV Hub Live does a lot of other work on a lot of other different kinds of incentives, but we're seeing a doubling rate of EV adoption everywhere. These things are coming, but if you can't charge them, you're in trouble, right? So people are going to need to be installing this infrastructure to charge. People charge at home typically. And the cost of doing it as a retrofit is like an orders of magnitude higher. So doing it when you've got the electrician on site and you're pouring the concrete, you don't have to trench later. That's critically important. I've already talked about how EV capable is really not, I mean, EV ready needs to be redefined, but EV capable is not a good solution for multifamily in particular. We really focus on equity in our work. California's codes were pretty inequitable when we got started. I'm pleased to say they have become much more equitable in the intervening 3 years. But yeah, typically multifamily residents, they don't know what's in the walls. They don't have the authority. They don't have the incentive alignment to spend money on what is essentially somebody else's property to upgrade it. And you don't need it. Every EV comes with a cord set, right? I guess the other thing I want to talk about is how fast this landscape is changing. So our toolkit is like a snapshot in time. And it's probably already out of date. It's only 2 weeks old, but I'm fully prepared for it to be totally out of date. But we need, the problem with codes is, like, I hope it's out of date. We need the codes to grow and change really, really fast, much faster than usual. And I know the same is true on the building side, right? Like with heat pumps, like we need that stuff to be happening much faster than it is happening. Codes by their definition are kind of slow moving. They tend to be about safety. When you're concerned about safety, you want to be conservative. And yet this transformation of the auto industry is coming hard and fast, and we need our codes to reflect that. And we need them to reflect it, especially when it comes to equitable access.
Thank you. We're going to talk more about equity and the impact of EV codes on affordable housing and lower income communities later in our conversation. So let's pin in that. Thank you for your discussion of your toolkit. Put a plug out there for everyone to check it out. Moving to Adam. So Colorado recently implemented an exciting new EV-ready building code, like you mentioned, in addition to an electric-ready building code specifically for building decarbonization. So can you explain to our audience what that means for Colorado and what building developers and owners in the state will be required to comply with as it goes into effect?
Yeah, so Colorado has been really progressive. I mean, I wouldn't say we're necessarily quite to California's level yet, but we've been really progressive with setting some pretty aggressive targets towards decarbonization across the sector, across all industries, not just buildings or not just transportation, but buildings and transportation are 2 of our 5 largest sources of emissions in Colorado. And so it was really an impetus for the state legislature to recognize that, look, we have a number of areas where we are really needing to improve, and we're needing to improve quickly. And how can we address those quickly? And one of the ways in Colorado, particularly given the fact that we are growing rapidly, a lot of new construction is going on in Colorado right now. One of the great opportunities for us is to be building a lot of these solutions into our new buildings now, so that we are avoiding costly retrofits and avoiding emissions from those buildings from day one, as opposed to being prepared, trying to go back and retrofit buildings that we are continually adding on to the system. And so the important thing really for Colorado right now is that we are getting everything prepared, right? We kind of really went from a paradigm of having no requirements at the state level. Pretty much every local jurisdiction can be preparing for this transition as they like. And that creates a really diverse and oftentimes complicated scheme for builders and folks in the building industry to meet, right? Is that they go from one community, which has one requirement, to the neighboring community, which has an entirely different requirement. And that's something that is really difficult. So in conjunction with trying to push more progressive push towards building electrification and transportation electrification, it also helps provide consistency for builders in the state of Colorado, so that they are able to work more consistently across all of these jurisdictions, as opposed to trying to balance between different requirements of different jurisdictions. So we really see this as a win-win for both homeowners, renters, building developers, and for our helping us reach our climate goals. So it's really a all hands on deck approach towards getting this done.
Thank you very much. And did you provide our audience with those exact percentages? Like, what are the exact goals of the code?
Yeah,
the developer have to. So a new developer goes in, they build a new multifamily property. What do they have to do?
So what they have to do really is, so essentially similar to what we were talking about for EV readiness or EV capable, there are certain, percentages of spaces that have to be made of these different space types. So there are a certain number of spaces that are going to have to be installed with EV chargers. So I think in multifamily housing, we started with 5% actually have to have the EV charger installed. And then I forget the exact percentages, but it's a total of, I forget the exact percentages among the different categories, but it's a total of 60% of spaces for multifamily housing. And we really recognize that as being a priority for Colorado because, as I said, growing very quickly, a lot of high density multifamily housing. And as Vanessa has talked at length about already, is that it's a major equity concern in Colorado, that making sure that people of all walks are able to access EVs and EV charging, and it's not limited based on your income level or based on your race or based on where in town you live, right? It's all dependent on, it's all equitably distributed so that everybody can have access to that charging. And then on the electric ready side, it's not dissimilar in that you have to essentially have all of the systems that are currently powered by fossil fuels. So that could be cooking, that could be space heating and cooling, that could be water heating, things like that. If there is a fossil fuel appliance that is installed at new construction, that essentially the infrastructure has to be there where that fossil fuel appliance can be removed and replaced with an electric one without significant improvements in the electrical infrastructure of the building.
Right. And as I work on buildings, Colorado is actually one of the most gas dependent states in the entire country. More than 75% of the state uses gas to heat their homes. So it's a great idea to think about pairing, if you're building a new structure, an all electric opportunity, not just for space heating, water heating, cooking, but also to integrate that EV charging solution as part of the whole package. So I think that was really forward thinking for Colorado to do that. I'd love to now move to Vanessa. So I think about your toolkit and your conclusions and your goals. I'd love to hear more about your takeaways, but in framework to this question is, what building segment do you see these codes having the greatest impact in facilitating EV adoption or charger deployment? And will these policies typically only apply to new buildings, or do you see codes in the US that require renovations or any retrofit existing buildings to comply with charging minimums? Because not every place has the high amounts of new construction going up. A lot of older buildings in the Northeast, the Midwest, they're not building as much.
Right.
So how can we apply to those markets as well?
Right. Yeah. Well, Adam mentioned this briefly earlier that a lot of codes do incorporate retrofits. Like if you're already resurfacing or you're already upgrading, and especially when there's all of this electrification happening, maybe you're already going in and you're upgrading your panel because you're electrifying your heating or you're electrifying your stove. At that point, the codes can and do. So in California's Cal Green definitely does require, under certain circumstances, if you're doing this and you're pulling a permit, you then have to add a certain amount of new charging. But addressing new construction is absolutely like the lowest hanging fruit and the first step, right? Because of that cost. And also, even though you're right, some places are building more than others. I don't know if you want to throw up on the slide, more multifamily housing means more charging. So that first slide is just the percentage of what's being built in the United States. And the dark blue is multifamily housing, and it's an increasing share of our housing stock. And then the next slide shows that data a little bit differently, which is just in actual numbers. And I like to show this because people who are familiar with the National EV Infrastructure Program, the NEVI funding, right? There's a ton of money coming with a really ambitious goal of building 500,000 EV chargers in the United States. That sounds incredible, right? We build 500,000 new multifamily units every year in the United States, and most of them have parking. So what we need are codes that require that new parking to have EV charging if we really want to deal with this equitably and deal with it, at a pace commensurate with the transformations happening in the auto industry. And I'm glad you brought up the toolkit. I forgot to plug it. So it's available. It's free. It's got a bunch of cool stuff in it, including our 4 principles. So you could throw that slide up. And I won't take all the time now to go through these, but just to say, like, if you go to the toolkit, it's at chargingforall.org. EV-Charing/toolkit. I'll put that in the comments also so people can see it, or maybe John can do that for us. It's got a whole bunch of background information. So those definitions that you were asking about, we've got a bunch of information there so people really understand kind of what the definitions are that might apply in their region. We have model code language. We refer to Colorado's wonderful code for home rule states. Best practices, which is this 4 principles. And then we also have a compendium, which is that snapshot I referred to, which is every single state and territory and insular area and DC. What do they have on the books? Do they have an EV code? What's their energy code landscape look like? Who else is working in this space in my region, so that if you decide you want to do something about getting better EV codes, you know who to reach out to, because nobody should do this work alone. We also have a short video that really illustrates the inequities that are present in most EV codes for multifamily residents. And then we have a slide deck and a webinar of me presenting the slide deck, and the slide deck is available as well for anybody who wants to use it. And the top takeaways were, we got a long ways to go. Most places don't have any EV code in place, so there's a lot of work to be done. Energy codes are really disparate. Our code map in the United States is very patchwork-like, and most EV codes on the books are inequitable for multifamily housing. So that's a really important place to start. And then I answer your other question, though. You had another question about
No, it's okay. You answered all of my questions. So what I'm hearing is that multifamily is this big target segment.
Yes, and affordable housing exemptions. We really need to rethink that. So right now, most codes have this exemption for affordable housing. And what I think is really critical is for people to rethink to incorporate in their conception of EV usage the full life cycle of the car. Because they're not a luxury good anymore, right? They are a critical means to achieving reduced energy burden on especially low-income communities, and improving health outcomes, especially for people whose communities have had freeways pushed through them, right? Like, we have to ensure that those communities get access to this clean technology, and that they get access to the lowest cost for that clean technology. I, as a homeowner, I pay like $1 a gallon equivalent to charge my EV. If I was living where my friend lives and had to charge on the commercial charging at her multifamily, I'd be paying the equivalent of like $7 a gallon. Like, that's not right. That's not right. So we have to have codes, and be honest, we have to have some regulation too, but we have to have codes that ensure that we have equitable access.
Thank you. Mentioning access, I'd like to pivot to another form of accessibility for people with disabilities. So I'm going to start with Adam on this question. So how do EV codes and ADA, or American Disabilities Act or Fair Housing Act accessibility requirements intersect? And do these codes take accessibility requirement into account? And if so, what might that look like?
Yeah, so in our codes, we did not add any additional specific accessibility requirements, but we did refer that jurisdictions that are building with these EV ready codes have to follow the accessibility requirements that already exist in the International Building Code, which does set certain minimum requirements that comply with ADA requirements and all of that. And in Colorado, many of our, well, probably not many, I would assume all of our jurisdictions have requirements in their land use or development codes that all relate to parking requirements and what accessibility parking has to have, and all of those components. And our code does not in any way infringe upon those. However, I do think that there are some things that we are currently in the process of figuring out how to make sure that our code requirements for EV charging we are making sure that accessible spaces are being made EV ready or EV capable, and that we're not excluding folks with disabilities from having access to EV charging. It's something that we have tried to address somewhat through the code that we have now, but it's definitely something that we are working on with our accessibility board, as well as others, to try to figure out what the answer is to that, because it becomes a bigger challenge too when you're taking into account EV readiness and EV capable, because the charger actually isn't there. And so a lot of people ask, well, do I need to make this space accessible when there's no actual EV charging there? And the answer is, we don't know yet. we haven't quite figured that out, because we're saying it has to be, you have to have a certain number of accessible spaces once the EV charging is installed. But does that mean you're going to have to completely reconfigure your parking lot because you made it from ready to installed? Those are some of the questions that we've definitely thought about, and we have not fully figured out answers to those questions. The city of Denver did include some, universal accessibility spaces in their EV code. There's some challenges that they're facing, and kind of similar to what I was saying about how to apply those and how that's actually going to work. And is that actually, until charging is actually installed, is that limiting spaces for other people? It's a very challenging thing that we are in the process of trying to figure out.
Thank you. Yeah, I imagine it's not an easy feat to try to pair accessibility requirements, EV code requirements, like electric requirements all at the same time, especially when developing with parking requirements, parking minimums, and people developing parking will tell you that is a big headache they face every day. Vanessa, any additions to the conversation around accessibility requirements?
Just to say that CalGreen does have accessibility requirements built into it. But I went back because I had, you had mentioned that you might ask about accessibility, and I was surprised to see that I don't think the IECC does call that out. And maybe Adam, if you know differently, please speak up. But
yeah, so it's the accessibility requirements for parking and for EV charging are actually not included in the energy code. It's included in the building code.
Got it. That's why
our code and the EV charging requirements in our code refer back to Chapter 11 of the International Building Code, which is where those live.
That's it. Okay.
And from what I understand too, doing this work, is that if charging is offered as an amenity, particularly at like a condominium building, if it has to, at least one has to be made accessible based on the Fair Housing Act requirement. That's what I understood, because especially condo buildings are under the FHA, not the ADA. And therefore, if something is offered as an amenity, that amenity has to be made available to those disabilities, at least in one space. So that's something that I think is also correct. I'm going to stick with the conversation around equity and the impact on affordable housing communities. So if we write these codes, we enact them, we tell affordable housing developers to comply with them as they build new properties, which we desperately need. How do we ensure that they can comply financially? How are they going to bear the cost of installing all of this new infrastructure? Where is that money going to come from? And how are we going to maintain that it doesn't get passed on to renters and their rents? Let's start with Vanessa on that question.
Well, first of all, I want to go back to this idea of looking more broadly at the full life cycle of an EV, right? So if you own an EV and you can charge it on your own electrical panel at residential rates, you are going to save a boatload of money. So even if a very small amount does get passed on to you, it will be much offset by the cost savings if you have access to that affordable electricity. Another cost saving measure that we advocate for is that low power level 2 that I mentioned earlier. And if you do that, if you provide EV ready with the definition that's now in CalGreen, we calculate it's about 0.5%, 0.5% of the project budget that is in addition to ensure that people have plug and play access. That's not a big cost increase. Like, it's just not. So, and it's a massive savings from the cost you're going to have to bear to retrofit if you don't do it when you build it new. Totally. And we recommend, so I know Colorado is not California, but we really, really recommend doing 100% of units rather than a certain percentage of spaces. Partly it's an equity thing, right? You don't say, okay, you're building 100 new single family homes and 50% of them need to have EV charging. You just put it in every single home, right? It should be the same if you build a 100-unit multifamily. Just because you live on the third floor doesn't mean you don't drive an EV, right? So that's an equity measure. But if it's put in code that every single unit has access, they can't jack up the price because it's an amenity. And it's an advantage of new housing over older housing, that's for sure. But it's just one of many new advantages for newer housing over older housing. The other thing is direct wiring and assigned parking. And I don't know how much time we have, but
got 1 minute.
We got 1 minute. Unbundled parking is not the same as limiting parking requirements. That is just, I'm just going to plant that seed. We need assigned parking to ensure those equity benefits reach residents of multifamily housing.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and go a little over because I really want to ask this question, especially I want to ask this to Adam, who's been in the trenches working on the codes. So I live in a big city. I know that parking is everywhere. Parking dominates the urban landscapes. One of the biggest issues in building any new construction is parking and the space and costs associated with building, designing, and developing structures for parking. So how will EV code requirements impact parking minimums and maximums? They have parking minimum requirements, whether they're underparked or overparked, they have to have a certain number of spaces. How will these codes directly impact our parking infrastructure?
So I would say that our parking infrastructure, EV codes are going to be one component in a much broader effort. I mean, in Colorado, one of the big goals that we have is improving transit-oriented development as well. Mm-hmm. So that's all of these things come into play concurrently, right? We can't just say how are EV charging requirements going to affect these in a vacuum versus how is transit-oriented development going to affect this in a vacuum. They all affect each other across these different issues. I will say that because Colorado is a home rule state, so much of this is still governed at the local level. Mm-hmm. So local land use codes, local development codes are still the ones that are going to be setting and enforcing the parking minimums or parking requirements for buildings. Our codes do not actually require new buildings to have parking. Our codes only require that if new buildings have parking, here is the requirements that you must meet from an EV readiness perspective. The same thing is true of like say a new development that is taking advantage of existing parking. We do not require that they suddenly then have to go in and install this EV readiness infrastructure in an existing parking lot just because the new building across the street is utilizing that parking, right? So our codes really are driving at making sure that new parking that is being built EV ready, but we are not necessarily at the state level trying to drive, restrictions on parking or, reducing parking minimums necessarily through this process. Now, there are other ways that we are trying to make sure that EV ready codes are not negatively impacting parking availability or parking minimums or anything like that, but our codes are not intentionally driving changes in parking minimums from this perspective. Now, as I said, there are a lot of other concurrent programs and efforts going on improving transit and improving access to walking and biking and all of those different opportunities that will thus hopefully reduce the necessity of having parking. But those are, all efforts that are kind of going on concurrently that are a little bit outside of the EV code realm.
I see. Yeah, I love the multimodal approach is sort of my ideal for any urban landscape or any development in general. Vanessa, anything to add around parking and how these codes intersect with the development of new parking infrastructure?
Well, I just want to add, I guess, that passing on costs to the resident or to the driver isn't really a problem. Isn't generated from providing charging access. Mm-hmm. The real problem is only providing charging via a limited number of expensive and unregulated commercial charging spaces. Mm. And that if we start thinking more globally about, like Adam was saying, using older spaces, not building new, but when you build it new, building it and building as much as possible into it when it's affordable and making it directly wired to the end user. If we can do that concurrent with public transit and walkable cities and safe streets, like we need all of it. And it's funny, as an EV driver and EV advocate, like I almost got hit by an EV the other day on my bicycle because it was so quiet and the driver was stupid and they like passed me in a really unsafe way. And I was like, we need safer streets. Like Adam's right. We need all of it. But I'm glad they, almost hit me in an EV and not in a Ford Bronco because,
The
They're not
irony
keeping
of
with their
perhaps how
pollution,
that
at
would,
least.
the irony of our life career choices and maybe how that would intersect. I'm going to import something very quickly from what we do on Buildings Hub Live, which is our lightning round, which is exactly as exciting as that sounds. And this is not something you have been discussed with before, but in about a minute or less, I'd like to understand what you envisage the future of the EV building code space to be. So in the next 5-10 years, whether that's in California or in Colorado or around the country, where do you think we'll be? What will be the future of this movement towards mandating electrification and EV charging in buildings? So what does that look like to you? Let's start with Vanessa.
I can see kind of I'm going to go with a positive view of the future, the one I want to see, not the one I'm worried is might going to happen. I think we're going to see a lot more electrification of fleets, a lot. I think we're going to, which is a great thing. I think we are going to see a lot more a need. I think we're going to see a sea change in terms of people's understanding of the change happening. I think most people don't get it yet, and I think in the next 5 years, people will really be getting it. They'll be like, "Oh, my next car is absolutely going to be an EV, not because someone told me it should be, but because it just will be. It'll just be obvious." I think that's the biggest change. Those are the two biggest changes that I see, and I hope that our codes will be catching up. Codes are, usually on a 3-year cycle. So I think at the earliest, we're going to start seeing a real sea change in codes probably about 3 years from now.
Thank you. And over to Adam, close us off.
Yeah, so I would say definitely from a starting point, one of the really positive things that we are seeing and we are hoping is that currently in the latest iteration of the International Energy Conservation Code development, there is EV readiness requirements in the base code. There were also EV readiness requirements in the 2021 base code, and those got removed at the last minute. So we're hoping that that's not going to happen this time. But I think that once you start incorporating these types of code requirements into these model codes, that's where we see the shift happening. Because the vast majority of the jurisdictions in Colorado are really the only ones I can speak to with personal experience. They adopt model codes pretty much straight as they are, right? There aren't a lot of amendments. We have a few jurisdictions who are very ambitious and work to strengthen the codes and work to amend the codes. But for the most part, we see pretty consistent straight up adoption. So I think the more we can start working these requirements also into these model codes, like we're doing in Colorado, this model code that jurisdictions just have to adopt, we start to see a much more fundamental shift in that direction. From the regulatory side, it's like the regulatory push, and then kind of what Vanessa was saying was, at the same time, you're getting the market demand for these types of things. And I think the market demand can help drive the regulatory push, right? The more that we're seeing demand for these vehicles and for charging for these vehicles in the market, the more it makes sense for policymakers to put these requirements into regulation. So I think that seeing kind of that push and pull is really going to help us be driving that at the local level, certainly in Colorado.
Thank you very much. You passed our lightning round with flying colors. Appreciate your participation. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for EV Hub Live. I want to say thank you very much to our guests for joining us, to provide their expertise and their insight. To everyone here in our live audience who participated in our conversation today. Should you wish to rewatch this episode or share it with a friend or colleagues, you can find it on the Atlas YouTube page, as well as on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and on Google Podcasts. We encourage you to check out Buildings Hub and to join our electrification community today. And if you want more buildings-related content, because you just could not get enough of it, mark your calendars for next Tuesday, October 24th, for our next episode of our sister show, Buildings Hub Live, where we'll dive into the great discussion on the upcoming and widely anticipated federal home electrification rebate programs, which is in also concert with EV programs. It's been a real pleasure serving today as your guest host today. Hope to catch you on the next episode of EV Hub Live. Have a great weekend, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.